yeah, tell me a little bit about yourself, the typical interview question.
Yeah, definitely. So I grew up in New York, grew up in Yonkers, and my parents are lawyers, and all my life I basically was somewhat steered in the direction of becoming a lawyer. Even though I felt a strong call to ministry, even though I was in college, I went to law school after and tried to do everything I could in my power to not become a pastor. And after when I was in law school, I realized I didn't want to do that for a long time. So finished law school, went to seminary, was kind of practicing law by day, seminary by night, and had, kind of an eye-opening experience while doing prison ministry, and learned about church planting in about 2009, and really decided at that point to leave law to start a church. The story gets a little longer because of personal stuff. Right after seminary, my late wife got sick with cancer, and she battled cancer. She had a very rare form of cancer called primary cardiac angiosarcoma, and battled it for about 10 months before she passed away.
Wow.
And so then I put everything on hold for ministry. I didn't care about anything really at that point. And about a year and a half.
How old were you guys?
I was 29,
Wow.
and she was 27.
Wow.
Yeah. So that was, there's not a huge community of people in their 20s who lose their spouses. So put everything on hold. And about a year and a half after she passed away, I started to really I couldn't put it down. I couldn't put down this notion that God wanted me to start a church, and a bunch of open doors kind of happened, and the rest is history with that. And I guess the good news, or the good part of that story, which I shouldn't forget, my present wife is also widowed. We met a couple years after my late wife passed away, and her late husband, he had passed away about 2.5 months after they got married in a motorcycle accident. And so we met through friends, and I don't know if she's watching right now, but she wouldn't leave me alone, and I decided I would let her stick around.
And you guys have
that's
two
my
kids?
version now. Two kids, two boys, 5 and 2. So sheltering in place with them has been fun.
Has been probably very productive.
Oh yeah, every day is nothing but productivity.
Well, I wanted to talk a lot with you about your sermon that you preached on Sunday. Obviously, You being in New York, you're right in the epicenter of the pandemic. Plus, there have been protests going on. Now people are calling for defunding police in certain places. So it's the news cycle's changing every 30 minutes. So it's hard to keep up with everything. But I wanted to, was your sermon on Psalm 10? I know you talked about it. Okay. And so Psalm 10 just starts off, "Why, Lord, do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? In his arrogance, the wicked man hunts down the weak who are caught in the schemes he devises." It's basically a psalm of lament. Why did you pick that psalm for Sunday?
Yeah, that's exactly how I was feeling. To be honest, it is extremely difficult to lead a congregation, a diverse congregation, or any congregation right now. And I wanted to give our people language so that they could understand how appropriate the Bible is to meet their present needs. And I think that people in our community were just feeling so angry, so hurt, so tired, so frustrated. And I wanted to give them permission to be frustrated and angry and tired and hurt at God, and to say, this is straight from Scripture. People are praying these prayers to God, and they're saying, God, why are you standing so far away? You're just letting this stuff happen. And these are biblical prayers that if you were just to pray through the Psalms, you would encounter about 40 to 50%, about 40% of the Psalms are in some form have some lament in them. And I think the American church doesn't have a good way to process our negative emotions. So we process them away from God and apart from God. And as a result, it really deforms us and stunts our discipleship process. And so that's on the practical side. That's why I did it. But just personally, that's the psalm that hit me. And I was like, this is exactly what I'm feeling. And it would be inauthentic and really unproductive of me to pretend that I was feeling something else. And I think our people expect me to just be faithful, of course, but also at the same time honest with exactly how I'm feeling. And Psalm 10 was like a pretty good recitation of that.
Well, it's funny you say you felt like you had to be honest with the congregation, because that's actually the first point of the sermon, to be honest to God. So I'm curious if you could, I loved your distinguishing between lament and grumbling. Is there any way you could expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, so grumbling I've defined as an inward discontent expressed to the wrong person. So, if I'm grumbling and I'm complaining about something, it's always better to go to the person. So, if we said something in this conversation and, I said something that offended you or you said something that offended me, and I go to someone else and start saying, oh, Bethany, she just did this, this, and this. It's so much better if I just take it to you, because that's the only way real relationship could happen, to be created, is really on the other side of conflict. So this inward discontent that many people are feeling, I know I'm feeling, this anger, this frustration that I'm feeling, not just at people, but at God, that needs to be taken to him directly, because I do believe that there is intimacy created on the other side of conflict, not in trying to avoid it. And some people they feel like God is going to strike them down if they express it. But I really feel like there's power in praying honestly to God, to pray through our anger, pray through our tears, because in doing that, it's an act of faith to say, God, you can tolerate this. You can listen, like you're listening to me. You hear me, you empathize, that you're God still in all of this, and you can handle every part of me, not just the praises.
Yeah, I love, you said in your sermon, and you just said now, like intimacy is on the other side of conflict. You talk in your sermon somewhat, I've listened to several, but that you used to try to avoid conflict. I'm an 8.
Oh yeah.
I'm an 8, so I run right into it too much probably sometimes. So can you talk a little bit about the overcoming that people pleasing to get to a point of honesty? Like it's like what helped you get through that?
I mean, with this situation, to be perfectly honest,
Yeah.
I am so angry that there are points in my life where I'm like, I'm never going backwards. Like this is now, it's like a video game that you're playing and you go through the ring on Sonic or something. And it's like, no matter what happens, you'll never go back from that one point. And this for me has been one of those points where I will never go backwards to playing patty cake with white supremacy, for example. It is pernicious. It is destructive. It threatens my life, the life of my sons, the life of my brother, my father, the people I love the most on this planet. And this was a moment for me that I was inwardly saying, I just don't care anymore. I will never go backwards. So for me, it really was something that seeing this ignited a fire inside of me that really burned away a lot of the people-pleasing tendencies I would have.
Yeah.
And, this past week I've been in conversations with a lot of friends and other pastor friends and other associates who certainly are surprised by the tone of a lot of people in my tone or whatever. And, they'll have to learn to deal with that.
Have you found during this particular season that even people that may have been more like, oh, it's a little too much, they're like, actually, I want to listen? Like, have you seen a shift in people's reception for being able to receive that anger?
No.
No.
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, some people, I would say the minority of people, but those people were already willing to listen.
Mm-hmm.
Most people now, a lot of people that I'm sensing now want to avoid criticism. So in this moment, a lot of people are doing the listening, they're having the conversations, and it really is just to avoid criticism, so that when their congregants or other people challenge them, they can say, well, look what I did. I brought in this black guy. We talked about this. We listened to what he was saying. Listening only has value to the extent that you put those things into practice. So James says it, don't be, hearers only, but be doers of the words. Every time a pastor preaches on generosity, they don't want their congregation just to listen. They want them to listen and put those things into practice that would translate into action. So the jury is still out in terms of how receptive people are, in terms of what people are implementing. For me, I'm recommending that everybody, especially all of my white and non-black brothers and sisters, spend some time looking at themselves. I don't want anyone making nice, neat statements denouncing racism in the world before they first denounce racism in them. In this world, it's impossible to not have been negatively impacted, informed by racism. It is in the water, it is in the air, it's an airborne pathogen. As a result, I really want people to spend some time doing a genogram or something of that way to think about how did your grandparents and your parents, how did they process race? How did they discuss race in your home? How did they talk about what were the ways in which your family of origin handled race? Now, they might not have been calling people the N-word at home, but what were the things? What were the subtle,
the narratives?
Yeah, the subtle narratives that were presented, and to think about how from that, why people right now are just as worried about property damage as they are, the destruction of Black bodies. So I think that's a really good thing that I want people to do in terms of listening, and I want people to really own that and to say, well, this is something that's formed in me as negatively as as much as I don't want this to be the case. This is what it is. So we'll see what people actually do in terms of putting that into practice.
Well, the second point of your sermon talks about the disciples' journey, learning, unlearning, and relearning. And I remember you and I are both, I always say like disaffected lawyers, maybe like, we trained lawyers, but don't practice. And one of the things I had to unlearn and then relearn is I've seen people in the past couple of weeks talk about the beauty of the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal and we need to live up to that ideal, and I've thought in my head, that when that was written, women could not vote, Black people could not vote. Like I had to relearn a little bit from when I was younger that I was taught this as an American, all men are created equal. We believe that as Christians, but we were not treated, me and you were not treated that way when that was written. And so I'm
Definitely
curious if you have any thoughts in particular for white people, for non-African Americans, for some things you think we need to relearn. Like what are some of the things that we need to relearn in our communities?
Yeah, I mean, one is this American history. I mean, the version of American history that is taught whitewashes so many different things that, the extreme example of that are people who have been, the extreme example of that are, people who taught that, slavery, there's textbooks, that say that slavery wasn't even that bad and people were well fed. And so that's an extreme example. But the other, I think what happens in most cases is they just leave a lot of stuff out. So like the impact of the Reconstruction and how Blacks were systematically denied opportunities to gain generational wealth, and that money governmentally was given to whites. So Black people still had to pay taxes, but that money was given to whites. So when we talk presently about the income inequality, it's directly correlated to actual national public policies and laws that were put out. So I think we need to relearn American history so we can have more empathy and understand better what's going on even in America and how we got here. Yeah.
You mentioned in your sermon, I think I would love you to talk about like some things we may need to relearn about how God works too. Like you talk about in your sermon that karma is we get what we deserve, and that's like what we get. And I think there's some teaching there even for white Americans or maybe all of us. Can you expound about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think, white privilege and white supremacy makes you feel like you wake up on third base and you think you hit a triple to a certain extent. But I think and we look at, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, and so much of racism is tied to capitalism and the way we understand the world. But one of the things that we need to relearn, when I talked about that in the sermon, some of that is coming from the frustration that I feel personally, because you see good people not getting treated well. And, Tim Keller talks about, Jesus Christ is really this person who lived the most morally upright life in human history, and yet he was treated horribly and lived through injustice and all these different things, and was crucified, obviously. So I think a lot of Christians we have a functioning model of theology, which is karma, that the reason my life is going well is because I've done well, and the reason their life is not going well is because they haven't done well. And the gospel completely undoes that, whether you're doing well or as a salve to people who are experiencing persecution, that it's not because you have done poorly in some instances. Sometimes people suffer for doing poorly, but generally speaking, Black people are not in the crucible of persecution and police brutality because we have done something to earn it.
Yeah. Sticking on this point for one more question, one of the things I've been thinking about is my fear a little bit that this I'm trying to think through what learning versus superficial learning looks like. There's a risk that we're in right now that this becomes like a superficial learning time, that we just go back. Like you said, this is a watershed moment for me. I'm never going back. I'm not going back. I'm wondering like how long it takes people to learn, what patience we should have for them, what impatience we should have. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about to that with just like superficial learning and how we can kind of maybe lean into how do we avoid that,
Yeah, I mean, Pete Scazzaro has some really good stuff on stages of learning. I think the first stage is just awareness for people. And some people right now, awareness is not the same thing as ownership. So one of the best ways to know how to explain this is like in a non-inflammatory way. Years ago, I heard a sermon on the importance of taking a Sabbath day, and it was a revolutionary concept for me to spend 24 hours being a human being, not a human doing. I heard that, it was good, but I still didn't really put it in my life. It didn't impact me too deeply. And over the years, I started to think, well, let me dabble around in this a little bit. I started to do it on and off, and I realized that I'm much healthier when I actually do it. And then I say, you know what, this is something that I need to guard, and I need to do it. And I started to do it more regularly. And, now my Sabbath today starts at 2 p.m. I will not miss it. I will not miss it, because now it has gone from just awareness that this is good to ownership, that I need to structure my life around this, because this is something that will maintain me. Without it, I am going to drown. So I didn't learn any new concepts about Sabbath in these last 6 years. However, putting it into practice in my life, it has started to take deeper roots. For some people, this is just an awareness moment where they are now aware. For other people, this is going to move more and more them in the trend of ownership, to where they now structure their life around it. And I don't want to diminish the importance of awareness, because that is a crucial first step. But I also don't want to put everybody on the same path or in the same place on this path, because some of us have been thinking about this a whole lot longer than others. And awareness is good. That's a good, crucial first step. And I don't want to discourage people who are just at this awareness level. It's going to take you time to really own it.
Yeah, that's good. Your third point, which I loved in Psalm, especially related to the Psalm, was humility. And you talked about the tension between like humility, like just before the Lord. Like we don't know everything, but we also don't deny the realities. I'd love you to just expound on that a little bit from your sermon.
Yeah, I think when you're praying, a prayerful posture in general is always humble, just because the relation between you and God, there's this, it's mystical in a certain way. I mean, we can't see God, we can't hold God, we don't know that he's actually hearing the words that we're saying. There is no feedback in your prayer closet. So there's a certain level of humility that happens in prayer. And I think in this moment, while we absolutely need to pray honestly, we do need to make space for faith. And one of the things I was reading I was reading this morning is Hebrews 11:13. It says, "These all died in faith, although they had not received the things that were promised. But they saw them from a distance, greeted them, and confessed that they were foreigners and temporary residents on earth." And so there's a certain aspect to people who live by faith, who still didn't see what they were promised, as we're told, and these people were commended for their faith. So there's a part of faith in general, by its very nature, that requires that we confess and profess the things that God tells us about who we are and who he is, regardless of our ability to see it, that we live in this gap where we trust what God says more than what we can see. And that is that space where humility will get you to this point where you can trust God in that way, hoping, praying, fighting for justice, speaking against injustice, all of these different things, getting involved, but also making a space where you say, God, it doesn't have to go the way that I said it has to go.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I listened to hours of your sermons last night. I was putting together several things, and it's a couple months ago, or 6 weeks ago, I guess you started a series on Philippians.
Yeah.
Philippians, beautiful, pretty positive as the gospel letters go, letter. And in this point on humility, holding that tension and trusting the Lord, one of your sermons was on joy and gratitude. And you said, basically, that's how we grow in the Lord, is through joy and gratitude. And my thought was just, wow, how do we how do we embrace joy and gratitude right now in this moment? I would love to know maybe how you're even experiencing it personally. How are you thinking about joy and gratitude in the midst of the mourning and the suffering that's happening?
Yeah, the piece about joy and gratitude, which is so fascinating from Philippians, is right before Paul says to rejoice. He says the Lord is near, and I don't know that I could express any gratitude unless I first believe that the Lord is near, and also verse 6, where he says, "I'm sure of this, that he who started a good work will carry it on to completion." So allowing the Holy Spirit to remind us that God is near to us is the only thing that will get me to a point of gratitude. Because although I absolutely am miserable and have been miserable for the last number of weeks, and just really in some ways so angry that I've lost sleep, sensing the nearness of God through the Holy Spirit is what gives me endurance to move forward and to say, God, you're with me, so, let's go. Yeah. And that's something I could be grateful for right now, that God, I don't have a lot to look forward to externally. I can't turn on the news and say, oh, there's some good news happening, with or without criminal charges happening, with or without indictments. Even if in a miraculous sweep there were all of these arrests and indictments and charges and trials and incarcerations, it still is not going to bring back anybody. Yeah. So no matter what happens, it's absolutely still going to be infuriating. But the nearness of God is something that allows me to still express gratitude, which kind of brings me to the last point of the sermon, which was...
Before you go there, you did mention something that I thought was really great, too, in that sermon. You said, God calls us to be, joy in our circumstances, not for our circumstances, which is kind of what I don't know if you want to say anything right there, but that's hard to do.
Yeah, when I preached that, we were only under one pandemic, not two.
I know. That's why I thought it was interesting to bring it together.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, because it's the point of our focus, right? So if I focus on the news, if I focus on police brutality, if I focus on the retweets about the cops pushing a 75-year-old man and, God busts his head wide open, if I focus on that, I'm not going to express gratitude at any point. So I think to a certain extent, we need to have barriers and to guard the things that are coming into our brain, the things that we're consuming. And in our circumstances, we can have gratitude alongside anger, frustration, only because we believe, and if we believe that God is near to us. If we don't believe that, then there's not going to be a space for gratitude. And gratitude also is not, again, Paul says to give thanks in all circumstances, not for all circumstances. And that's a declaration of faith. Yeah. To say, God, I believe that you're with me.
Now you go, fourth point. How do we do it?
The fourth point was something that to me is so profound. So when I read the list of names of people, of names of Black men, women, and kids, like Tamir Rice, that were killed by police, it makes me so wildly angry that I want to punch a hole through a wall. And my temptation is to believe that, God, you don't understand this. There's no possible way you understand. And when I'm reminded of the cross, you start to see how much Jesus understands this, because he himself was lynched by a corrupt criminal system. If you look at his trial, if you look at his arrest, his trial, and the actual execution, all of it was done illegally. There's a book that talks about this and expounds on this. But basically, when he was arrested by night, it was with the people, it was with the person who turned him over. So there was a testimony and evidence of just Judas, who was a co-conspirator. He had been walking with Jesus. And so his arrest by night in that way, with Judas being there, with the high priests being there, that was illegal, because those high priests were the people who were the fact finders of his actual case. So the person who arrested you should not have been the person who was actually now trying your case. And then you see, they didn't take him to a public courthouse. They took him to Caiaphas's house. So they took him where it happened was also illegal. And when it happened, it was before dawn that they actually started and did these trials. So the people who could have even acquitted Jesus weren't even there. They weren't even notified. So you have people rushing to judgment. And it was the same people who arrested him were the jury and also the executioners. So, and then but when they got to Pontius Pilate, they changed the charges on him. So they had been saying these different things when they were talking to Jesus, but then when they bring him to Pilate, they say something completely different. So you have these trumped up charges that is a completely corrupt system. And, even Jesus being struck during his trial, even him being beaten before his trial and during his trial was illegal because that prohibits you from actually stating your innocence or fighting for your life in this case. So all of these different things that they did were so corrupt, and Jesus knows exactly what it feels like to be lynched by a corrupt criminal justice system. Jesus knows what it's like to have a mother weep over a body that's beaten beyond recognition. His mother saw him on the cross, and he knew exactly what it feels like. So when I'm praying to God, I say, God, you know exactly what it feels like to have a mother crying over her slain son. You know exactly what it feels like to be turned over, to have sidewalk justice, the judge, jury, and executioner all in one setting. You know exactly what that feels like. You know way more than I do. And so in a world where there's so much suffering, I could not believe in a God if he himself was not touched by it. And as a result, there is so much now more confidence I can come to Jesus with to say, Jesus, I don't understand what's going on, but I certainly know that you understand. And that gives me hope to continue rocking with Jesus.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. One more, how does the resurrection change anything?
The resurrection always makes space for wonder and mystery.
Yeah.
If you would have, that Friday, if you would have interviewed, I wish we had Instagram Live and, iPhones 2,000 years ago. I wish we could have captured the interviews with the disciples and said, yo, how are you feeling right now? They would have been absolutely miserable and running away, scared for their lives. And, Jesus got up. The resurrection tells us that God has the power, period.
Yeah.
And that nothing can hold him down. He is all powerful, and he can turn situations. He can turn situations around. So I've been praying today, God, show us your power. Stand up, show us your power. Show us your power.
Yeah. I remember, Jordan, when I was in law school, I worked at the U.S. Attorney's Office, and I worked on a capital case where the guy was facing the death penalty for killing a couple people. And because I was an intern, I couldn't sit at the table with all the attorneys, so I sat next to the victims' families, and so I got to know the sisters and primarily the sisters of the two guys that were killed. And I remember going into the bathroom one day. It was testimony for like 2 months. And going into the bathroom one day, and she was, crying, and she said to me, Bethany, even if this guy gets convicted, even if he gets sentenced, even if the full, hand of the law comes down on him, he can't bring my brother back. He can't do it. And I couldn't have said anything because I was representing the U.S. Attorney's Office, but I was thinking in my head, I was like, man, only Jesus can bring that resurrection so meaningful, because he raises the dead. That's the justice we need. And so as much as I pray for justice every day, I'm like, it's still so proximate, but yeah. Yeah.
I mean, we were built for eternity. And once we take our eyes off of that, then, nothing in this world would satisfy us. No matter how much justice, you have to bring an eternal perspective into it. Christianity doesn't make sense as just a right here faith. And I get the people who warn against a pie in the sky religion, and I warn against that as well.
Yeah.
But we certainly have to make room to understand how eternity and all of this plays into the way we view our hope.